Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. I want to start this episode by saying that I have completed my long re-recording of the first 14 episodes of this podcast. Using an AI voice was an obvious misstep. From this point forward, every episode is being recorded using my own voice. If you're a listener, thanks for your patience during this process. In the last episode, we talked about the 1850s in Austria. The decade had begun with seeming stability, albeit at the price of any of the reforms of the 1848 revolution. However, the decade had ended disastrously for the empire and its leader, Emperor Franz Joseph, with defeat and loss of almost all of its Italian territory. The Austrian Empire was now also isolated diplomatically as a result of its neutrality in the Crimean War. But the changes undergone by Austria during the 1850s were not merely diplomatic. Franz Joseph had imposed absolute rule on the empire, and domestic repression had resulted. Freedom of speech was sharply curtailed, and the Catholic Church was granted wide-ranging privileges under Interior Minister Baron Alexander von Bach. That said, Bach was economically liberal and relaxed protectionism within the Austrian Empire. He also helped to fully abolish the remaining feudal obligations on the Austrian peasantry. In short, while personal freedom was regularly infringed upon, economic freedom was greatly expanded. Nevertheless, Austria limped into the 1860s uncertain and unstable. No simpleton, Franz Joseph understood that absolute rule could not last forever. Only a more open society would lend itself to true stability that would last. Therefore, in early 1861, the emperor issued what came to be known as the February Patent, which amounted to a new constitution for the empire. A legislature called the Reichsrat was created for Austria. This new parliament included an upper house consisting of the nobility and a lower house called the Abgeordnetenhaus that would be popularly elected, albeit by only a small percentage of the male population. However, the emperor retained substantial power to himself. Unfortunately, the creation of the legislature ended up inflaming emotions more than mollifying them. German speakers were angry at what they saw as major concessions being made to the non-German speaking ethnic groups of the empire. Meanwhile, non-Germans thought that the February Patent didn't go far enough, and the Hungarians refused to acknowledge the new constitution at all, even though a separate legislature for them remained part of the new constitution. Clearly, the February Patent wasn't sufficient to assure long-term stability. In the meantime, war had broken out yet again. Otto von Bismarck, the minister-president of the Kingdom of Prussia, had begun the process of cobbling together what would become in 1871 the German Empire. Beginning in 1848, member states of the German Confederation had been fighting the Kingdom of Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein in the border region between Denmark and the German Kingdom of Hanover. After 4 years of war, Denmark had been victorious. However, less than 2 years later, King Christian IX of Denmark signed a new constitution that reasserted exclusive Danish right to the two duchies, thereby violating the status quo agreement that had ended the war. Bismarck reached out to Franz Joseph for help, and the two agreed to have their countries go to war together in February 1864. The two armies invaded Denmark and fought for 9 months before emerging victorious. Schleswig and Holstein were given to Prussia, while Austria received adjacent territory in Lauenburg. However, despite acting as allies in this war against Denmark, Austria and Prussia did not have friendly relations thereafter. There was still the ongoing rivalry within the German Confederation between the two countries. With an independent Italian kingdom declared in 1861 as an ally, Bismarck went to war against Austria in June 1866. The member states of the Confederation took sides, but when the smoke cleared less than 6 weeks later, Prussia had been victorious. Territorial adjustments as a result of the war were minor, but the German Confederation was dissolved. Instead, Prussia and Austria began to chart definitively separate paths. On its side, Prussia moved forward with creating a new confederation called the North German Confederation. There had been two visions for German unification called, respectively, the Greater Germany and Lesser Germany solutions. The former would have included Austria, while the latter would not. Several issues prevented unification of Austria with the burgeoning German Empire, but Austria's non-German population was a major factor. Bismarck already knew that the Catholic Slavic population of the former Polish state would be a problem for his empire. Including Austria with all its territory would only complicate that matter by including not just Catholics, but also Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Therefore, not only Austria, but also 4 other southern German-speaking states were prevented from joining the new confederation. Also at issue was who would lead a greater Germany that included Austria. Franz Joseph would likely insist that he become the first German emperor, or Kaiser. Bismarck, of course, preferred the King of Prussia, Wilhelm. On the other side of the new border, Austria had lost yet another war, this time to its major German-speaking rival. Franz Joseph needed to strengthen his empire, and a solution offered itself in rapprochement with Hungary. The solution devised was the Compromise of 1867, by which a dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary was created. As we discussed in a previous episode, Hungary had been subjected to military rule since 1849, when Austria crushed the Magyar National Revolution with the help of Russia. Now, almost 20 years later, Franz Josef's empire was substantially diminished in size. To make matters worse, its largest remaining constituent part, the Kingdom of Hungary, was still quite resentful of past events. Stephen Beller describes the compromise as follows, quote, "This agreement was intended to turn the Habsburg monarchy into a German-Magyar condominium, the Magyars ruling Hungary and the Austrian Germans ruling the rest of the empire. Francis Joseph was to continue as a quasi-constitutional monarch in both halves, as king in Hungary and as emperor in the rest of the monarchy." Ironically, Austria disappeared as an official name. While the dual monarchy as a whole was Austria-Hungary and Hungary was officially Hungary, the non-Hungarian half, which in population terms was more like 57% of the whole, was not Austria, but rather the lands represented in the Reichsrat. Informally, this territory was called Austria, and semi-officially it was known as Cisleithania, the river Leitha being the border between Lower Austria and Hungary. Only in 1915 was Cisleithania officially allowed to be called Austria, end quote. The types of states that the compromise created on the two sides of the border were quite different. The Kingdom of Hungary was planned to be a nation-state, that is, the state of the Magyar people, with the rights and freedoms of non-Hungarian minorities, including Croats, Slovaks, Romanians, and others given only secondary consideration. Further vestiges of feudal privileges remained very much in existence, with only 8% of the population, primarily nobles and other prominent citizens, entitled to vote. On the other side of the border, Cisleithania, which on this podcast we'll continue to call Austria, was a multinational state, or what has been called a Vielvölkerreich, that is, a realm of many peoples. Moreover, while it was not much more democratic than Hungary in 1867, 40 years later, it would be among only a handful of states worldwide with universal male suffrage. Political science nerds, particularly those who geek out over 19th century Europe, will know that what was created in 1867 was what is called a real union between Hungary on the one hand and the remainder of the Austrian Empire on the other. A real union is distinguished from other kinds of political unions in that, in a real union, states governed by the same monarch are considered distinct but share a few institutions. In the case of Austria and Hungary, the monarch, the military, and the foreign ministry were shared, but nothing else. On this podcast, we will be leaving Hungary behind for the most part from this point forward. I don't know whether there's a podcast on Hungary out there, but in the event that there is, let them handle Hungarian history. This is a podcast about Austria. The Compromise of 1867 was not the only big news of that year. At the end of the year, Franz Joseph promulgated yet another new constitution. This was the so-called December Constitution, which was really a series of basic laws that clarified the imperial powers and institutions, beyond establishing official rules and responsibilities for the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. The new constitution also included a basic law on the general rights of nationals, or Staatsgrundgesetz über die allgemeinen Rechte der Staatsbürger, which amounted to a Bill of Rights. Among the rights enshrined in this law were equality for all ethnic groups, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. Nevertheless, Franz Joseph retained substantial powers to himself. When the legislature was not in session, he had the power to rule by decree. He also appointed his own council of ministers, who in turn were not responsible for the legislature but only to the emperor. Moreover, as Emperor Franz Joseph enjoyed the loyalty of the aristocracy, who still wielded significant political power, both by sitting in the upper house of the Reichsrat and in terms of the complicated system by which elections were held. According to this system, numbers of seats in the lower house of the legislature were delegated on the basis of social status, with the aristocracy and landed gentry holding the balance of the power. Although this system would change with time, it favored the emperor in the short term. For the first decade or so of the new dual monarchy, the Austrian government was dominated by liberals. We discussed liberalism in a previous episode. Rather than reinvent that wheel, suffice it to say that we are speaking here of liberalism in the European sense, an emphasis on individual liberty, a capitalist economy, limited government, and the rule of law. Among the early accomplishments of the liberal government was the May Laws of 1868, according to which free education was provided to all citizens through 8th grade, and the power of the Catholic Church was substantially diluted through provisions such as legalizing civil and interreligious marriage. The Church was not happy about the new laws, and the relationship between Austria and the Vatican suffered as a result. It suffered further when, in 1870, Pope Pius IX pronounced the doctrine of papal infallibility. This doctrine stated that when the Pope spoke on matters of faith and morals and was seated in the throne of St. Peter, his judgment could not be questioned. In response, Franz Joseph fully abrogated his own 1855 treaty with the Vatican, although the May laws had done much of that work already. And this was not the last time Franz Joseph would clash with the Catholic Church, and his relationship with the Vatican would undergo several highs and lows over his long reign. For the first 6 years after the compromise with Hungary, the head of government in Austria changed on average more than once per year. Hoping for greater stability, the government moved to change the electoral laws. The voting system was changed such that chambers of commerce became the most powerful group, one deputy for every 27 people, followed in order by the estate owners, one deputy for 63 people, the urban curia, one deputy for 1,600 people, and the rural curia, one deputy for 7,900 people. Within each curia, any man who was at least 30 years old and could pay a poll tax was eligible to vote for his representative. It was hoped that direct election of Reichsrat members would yield the much sought-for greater stability, but a market crash in early May intervened before a new Reichsrat elected under the reform could be convened. And that's where we'll pick up in the next episode. Thanks for listening.